Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Chris. I just wanted to show this. This was a Christmas gift I got from my niece. It is a calendar, but what's nice, if you open to a random month, June, it's got a bunch of different things on here. So like June 14th, 1863, Confederate, CSA troops at Point Hudson repel attack by General Nathaniel Banks. Just a fact, a day-by-day it's day-by-day chronology. Is that right? That doesn't sound right either. Anyways, that's what it goes for. And then look, just thought I'd change shirts for the occasion, because this is the part where they talk about Abraham Lincoln learning to swim, I believe. I could be wrong. If you've seen part 1 and 2, then good, because this is part 3 and it's not part 4 yet. So here we go.
Meanwhile, Northern clamour for an advance upon the Confederate capital of Richmond became irresistible, and Lincoln yielded to it, authorizing a force of 28,000 to leave Washington on the 16th of July and march into Virginia, where the First Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas as it is known in the South, saw the Union force routed from the field, with Union soldiers fleeing all the way back to the capital. The defeat was a devastating blow to Union morale, and Lincoln immediately ordered General George McClellan, a graduate of the West Point Military Academy, to come to Washington and take command of the newly created Army of the Potomac, hoping to instill organization and discipline into the young volunteers of the Union Army. Much to Lincoln's satisfaction, McClellan appeared like the perfect man for the role given to him, and McClellan transformed the inexperienced band of eager Northern recruits into a disciplined fighting force, rigorously training his troops and keeping a watchful eye over their progress and well-being. Moreover, McClellan was admired.
I'll say that I booed because McClellan was not good, but he was great at getting his guys ready to fight. He would have been great being in charge of getting the guys ready and then sending them to people who are better equipped at handling soldiers on the field. Easy to say that now, but you know, different times, may not have went over well back then.
By his troops, more so than any other Union commander throughout the war. But public opinion soon turned against the Union commander, as it became apparent that McClellan was extremely reluctant to use the Army of the Potomac that he had so skillfully crafted. And as summer turned to autumn, despite possessing a fighting force far superior to the Confederate army camped at Manassas, McClellan's forces were infuriatingly stagnant, drawing the anger of Congress. Lincoln's thoughts were soon turned away from the capital to across the Atlantic, where on the 8th of November, an American warship stopped the English steamer Trent and took 2 Confederate diplomats from her by force. And although initially applauded by public opinion and by Lincoln himself, the president soon realized Britain was outraged by this violation of international maritime law, and there was...
Isn't it funny? They're offended that we did that. Yet back in the War of 1812, they were just stopping ships and taking people and impressing them into their thing. Not all just British, they're taking Americans too. The tables have turned.
Even talk of Anglo-American conflict over the issue. With extreme reluctance, Lincoln and his cabinet on the 26th of December agreed to release the Confederate prisoners to appease the British, and although this disappointed many in the North, the decision Lincoln made had averted the greatest threat, which was that the American Civil War would become an international conflict.
It was better to do that. As he says, let's focus on one war at a time. If he would have brought them in, the British certainly weren't going to be fighting for the Union. So be humble about it now, deal with it later.
The winter of 1861 to 1862 was a trying time for Lincoln and his administration, as Congress and the public grew ever more irate at the inaction of McClellan, who was with his large and costly army still laying idle on the Potomac, refusing to launch the autumn campaign that he had promised months earlier. And so, in January 1862, Lincoln announced to his generals, quote, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it." Indeed, the president's frustration became evident to all when he published a general war order which commanded all Union forces to make a general advance by the 22nd of February and threatened to hold all commanders to account for carrying out the order. And although the 22nd of February passed without a general advance, Lincoln was cheered by Union victories in the West. Following the routing of Confederate forces in the Battle of Mill Springs in Kentucky on the 19th of January, General Ulysses S. Grant captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson on the Tennessee River in early February, and with the Confederates abandoning Kentucky and most of Tennessee, a Union force occupied Nashville on the 15th of February. However, the positive news from the West was overshadowed by the devastating tragedy in the Lincoln household, when on the 20th of February, after becoming ill with typhoid fever, Lincoln's third son William died. His son's death was to take a heavy toll on Abraham, who wept for days and turned to religion for solace. In addition, Lincoln's despair was not helped by the utter devastation felt by Mary Lincoln, who took to her bed for 3 weeks at the news, and for months to come would weep at the very mention of her dead son's name. Meanwhile,
I can't say that I've ever lost a child, but I'm pretty sure that laying in a bed for 3 weeks mourning, to me, is acceptable, because I can't tell someone else how to mourn or for how long. So, yeah. Different for me to say that Abraham Lincoln should have done that. If that's what you want to do, you have to resign the presidency to do that. Help us out.
General McClellan was finally preparing to move his Army of the Potomac, insisting on the plan to capture the rebel capital of Richmond with an advance from the east, despite Lincoln arguing for an assault on the Confederate army at Manassas. And as McClellan had very little respect for the president, or the notion that civilian authorities must outweigh military leadership in a democratic society, he insisted upon his Richmond plan. When McClellan's army at last took the field in early May, the general continued to test the president's patience, as his mistaken belief that the Confederates outnumbered him caused him to constantly ask Washington for more reinforcements, when in reality, the Army of the Potomac outnumbered the rebels by almost 3-1. The Lincoln administration was now desperate for military success, as apart from some small Western victories, the Union had barely dealt any damage to the Confederate forces, and in Congress the inexperienced president lacked allies, and furthermore, many European nations were coming close to recognizing the cotton-growing Confederacy, as cotton shortages began to cause unemployment in Europe. Lincoln needed a victory to shore up his support at home, and convince the nations of Europe that the Confederate States were a band of rebels that would soon be put down by the United States government. However, McClellan's Peninsular Campaign was a notable failure, being riven by indecision and despair at the imagined superiority of the Confederate numbers. In reality, McClellan was out of his depth when faced with the military genius of the rebel commander Robert E. Lee, who launched a series of determined attacks to drive the Union away from Richmond in the 7 days battles from the 25th of June to the 1st of July, and although most of his time and energy were consumed by military matters, Lincoln had not forgotten the great issue which had been the cause of the war. In June and July of 1862, Lincoln began privately drafting an emancipation order, and McClellan's defeats on the peninsula, the near mutinous state of the Army's officers, the swelling vocal chorus of anti-slavery opinion in the North, as well as the growing frustration at the president in Congress, all acted to convince Lincoln that, quote, "we must change our tactics or lose the game." Consequently, on the 22nd of July, Lincoln presented his cabinet with the first draft of what was to become one of the most renowned documents in the history of the United States, which was the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that would grant freedom to all slaves within states that were in rebellion from the Union as of the 1st of January, 1863. Though largely approved by his cabinet, Lincoln took the advice of Senator William Seward, his Secretary of State, who argued that issuing this proclamation following the Union's string of military setbacks would appear as a desperate move by a weak government, and so Lincoln therefore set the proclamation aside, declaring that, quote, "we mustn't issue it until after a victory." It was the case, however, that a victory remained infuriatingly elusive, and Lincoln had by this time concluded that McClellan would never attack the enemy, as his immense army still lay stationary on the peninsula, and the requests for reinforcements continued, and so he informed General Halleck, who had overall command of the Union armies, that he would keep or remove McClellan as he pleased. Meanwhile, due to his lack of faith in the Army of the Potomac, Lincoln organized a second Union force under General John Pope, who advanced on Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in August 1862, and at the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, from the 28th to the 29th of August, the Confederate forces won another victory, ultimately driving the Union forces from eastern Virginia. As he often did throughout his life, Lincoln fell into a state of depression or melancholy. His plan to defeat General Lee's army and capture Richmond had failed utterly, and with Pope's defeat he could not issue his Emancipation Proclamation, and furthermore, Lee did not rest on his laurels following his great victory. Rather, he launched an invasion of Maryland, sending a wave of fear across the North.
The war in Ukraine forced my family to flee. My sister, mother, and grandmother left their entire lives behind on February 24 and moved.
As General Lee's army advanced, Lincoln seriously considered scrapping his proposed Emancipation Proclamation, believing that the Union must now fight a defensive war with a defensive policy on slavery, and he was encouraged in these thoughts by congressional moderates, but the president decided to, instead, entrust the matter to Providence, telling his cabinet that, quote, "if God gave us victory in the approaching battle, he would consider it an indication of divine will, and he would, quote, move forward in the cause of emancipation." This indication arrived on the 17th of September at the Battle of Antietam, when McClellan's forces clashed with Lee's army in the single bloodiest day of the war, and although not the overwhelming victory Lincoln had hoped for, the invasion was halted and Lee was forced to retreat back into Virginia. And then, on the 22nd of September, when Lincoln and his cabinet agreed to officially publish the Emancipation Proclamation, far from decrying the immorality and evil of slavery, this document cleverly portrayed the president's action as simply a military necessity to ensure the preservation of the Union. Nevertheless, whatever the motive or wording of the proclamation, the final line stated that on the 1st of January 1863, all persons held as slaves in any state in rebellion against the United States would be forever free, and whilst abolitionists were jubilant, hailing the proclamation and the president, the decree met mostly a hostile reception. Southern Confederates and Unionists alike denounced the measure, as did Northern Democrats and moderate Republicans, who believed that Lincoln's actions would undermine the loyalty of the border states, who had remained faithful to the Union, and even many abolitionists, after their initial euphoria, came to dislike the proclamation as it failed to abolish slavery in states that had not seceded, such as Kentucky and Maryland.
It was a juggling act. He couldn't free across the board because he couldn't risk losing those states. So you have to keep those states on your side or neutral, free everyone else, and then afterwards you could say, okay, now you have a window that's closing on slavery. So it was juggling.
Meanwhile, McClellan once again stagnated, failing to pursue Lee's wounded army and allowing it to slip back across the Potomac unhindered. And when he eventually began his pursuit, the army moved at a snail's pace, taking 9 days to cross the Potomac River, and so, by this time, the president had reached his breaking point, and on the 5th of November, McClellan was removed of his command and replaced by General Ambrose Burnside, a 38-year-old West Point graduate. Ambrose Burnside, however, was not confident in his own ability to command such a vast army, and these self-doubts were soon vindicated when the Union Army blundered into a disaster at Fredericksburg on the 11th of December, engaging in a frontal assault against heavily fortified Confederate positions and sustaining 13,000 casualties.
I think the Battle of Fredericksburg is where the Angel of Fredericksburg is. I think it's the Angel of Fredericksburg. That's what I'm saying. I don't remember his name. Young kid, 18, Confederate. After the first day of fighting, he was listening to the moans of just soldiers on the battlefield that were wounded. He gets tired of hearing it, jumps over, and runs onto the field. This is at night for a ceasefire. Well, not a ceasefire, but typically they stopped fighting at night. And he just runs over with his water bottle, canteen, and just starts giving water to soldiers. The Union troops saw him over there, so of course they pop their guns up and they're tracking him and seeing what he's doing, and they realize, oh, he's giving water to them. Confederate soldiers are throwing their canteens onto the field, so Union soldiers are like, let's see, why not? They start throwing canteens on the field. He's running around grabbing canteens, just letting people get water. Once it's empty, throwing it back to the side it came from. People were cheering him. He went all over. I'm gonna look him up after this is over. But I think he did all that in one night, and then he went back to his side and he cried. But he was 18 or 19. He eventually died at the Battle of Chickamauga. Now, there were 2 battles at Chickamauga. The first one went Chickamauga, and they chased them back up to Chattanooga, and that was where General Thomas was involved for the Union. He saved them in their retreat. And then the next time was when Grant took over, first battle as leader of all Union forces, and he went into Chickamauga to make amends for that loss. So, but the Angel of Fredericksburg, and I think that's also Fredericksburg, the night maybe after the first fight. Is that where Stonewall Jackson was shot by his sentries, lookouts, whatever you want to call them? And then he eventually died. I passed Fredericksburg in 21 going up to Mount Vernon. Let's be honest, I stopped at the Waffle House there. And then I really wanted to go and kind of look around the battlefield, visit. I think there's a home where Jackson was taken to. And I just didn't. It was my last day, and I just wanted to go to Mount Vernon. I just wanted to go to Mount Vernon. Sorry. Sometimes I mumble. I apologize.
Lincoln.
Sometimes I also pause and throw out random comments that it just means something to me, so I share.
Aware that Burnside's immense failure had caused a loss of confidence in government from the officers and troops, relieved him of his command on the 25th of January 1863, and replaced him with General Joseph Hooker, who was nicknamed Fighting Joe for his vigorous leadership style in the field.
Oh, Fighting Joe Hooker. Last name Hooker. Women used to follow his unit, and at night he would allow his men to pay for sex from the women, if you see where I'm going with this. Hence, the women that followed were called Hooker's gals, and that was the women you could pay to have sex with. And later on it was just shortened to hookers. Share that with your mom, right? Share that with a child. Everyone needs to learn these things.
Amidst the continuing military woes endured by Lincoln at this time, came a day that was perhaps the most significant of his presidency, and one that will be remembered by posterity, when on New Year's Day, 1863, the president signed the Emancipation Proclamation into law. And although Lincoln had been hounded by self-doubt over the decree since its conception in the summer of 1862, he announced that, quote, "I never, in my life, felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." The final proclamation, as well as declaring the slaves of the South free, announced that former slaves would be accepted into the Union's armed forces, and thus black regiments began to be formed for the first time in the history of the American Army, with Lincoln actively encouraging the recruitment of African American soldiers, believing them to be the Union's decisive weapon against the Confederacy. And although General Hooker quickly injected life into the army with a bold plan to attack the Confederate rear, he was defeated at Chancellorsville in early May due to the military genius of Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And buoyed by the seeming invincibility of the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee launched a second invasion of the North, and by this time, the president was distraught. "My God," he exclaimed, after receiving news of Chancellorsville, "what will the country say?"
Chancellorsville, I'm sorry. That's where Stonewall was shot, I believe. Yeah, Fredericksburg was the Angel of Fredericksburg. Chancellorsville was where he was shot. I'll find out.
Lincoln and his administration began to come under intense criticism from Congress and public opinion, as Northerners tied the Lincoln presidency to the extensive pattern of failure and incompetence that had so far defined the United States war effort. And indeed, there were also sharp divisions within Lincoln's cabinet, and the picture painted by Northern newspapers was of an administration rife with division and discord. This anger towards the administration was heightened by the passage of the Conscription Act in March 1863, making all able-bodied men between the ages of 20 and 45 subject to a call to national service, which many denounced as tyrannical, and indeed, this tension was most visible in the violent draft riots of July 1863 in New York City, where anger towards the conscription law and the administration as a whole led to 4 days of bloody protests.
Perfect. We're going to end this video here, and I'll come back with my IP and Pool shirt. I'm going to take a little break. It is 7:44. I'm going to do a couple more videos. I took the week off because it was Christmas. And now I really wish that I had done videos, because I was bored at times and I didn't want to force myself. But, you know, it is what it is. So I'm going to end this video here. Like and subscribe. And I'm going to go ahead and jump into part 4 in a little bit. Bye, y'all.